When you start a company, there's really no guide or handbook on just how to scale your team. All companies are different. All companies need to scale differently. But I think that most importantly with startups, things are moving so fast that your scale strategy needs to be flexible. I don't think that anybody can write a book on how it is done. But I want to share some of my own lessons, what we've learned growing Slidebean from 3 founders to 36 full-time employees. So let's start with co-founders. I've talked about this before, and I've also covered how to find co-founders, so I'm not going to dive into that today. I will just mention this premise that I have, which is that you and your co-founders should or must have the ability to build and scale your company without needing any external skills. In other words, the skills needed to get your company from zero to, say, $100,000 in revenue should be covered by your co-founding team. For a mobile app, let's say that that's front-end, back-end, UX, growth, as in marketing, and operations. For a B2B SaaS company, that's also front-end, back-end, UX, operations, but probably sales or business development more than marketing. If these skills are critical to building the company or the startup that you're trying to build, then these skills should not come from your hires. They should be in your co-founders because you will not be able to recruit top talent at the earliest stage with no salary budget. If you want a game-changing team for little money, the only way to bring them is as co-founders. Also, the fewer, the better. You want people who cover more than one of those skills so that you can cover that skill set with the smallest team possible rather than ending up with 5 co-founders and then 5 mouths to feed when you have very little money for salaries. The next category for me is scaling the team from 3 to 10 people. Looking back, our first 7 hires were absolutely critical to the company that we would become. That team defined our company culture with echoes that we can feel even today, even if some of them are no longer with us in the company. To me, those hires need to be proactive, fast-learning people that are not necessarily specialized in one single task. They need to be able to wear many hats. They need to have the capacity and the willingness to do a task that is completely different from what they were hired to do. The kind of work relationship that you form with them will define your company. It will define it in more ways than you can imagine if you're at that stage, trust me. Now, one approach that worked for us for this specifically was using a Myers-Briggs test as part of the application process. Myers-Briggs is a psychological profile test. Now, this would allow us to understand their personality type and determine if they were going to get along with the rest of the team. We especially checked compatibility with their teammates and direct superior. Now, during this time, we hired 1 developer, 2 customer success/customer support people, 2 marketing people, 1 office manager, and 1 head of sales who would eventually become our chief revenue officer. Pretty much all of those roles joined the company ready to wear many different hats. By the way, one very big mistake that we made at that stage as the team grew was assuming that these earlier employees wanted or were qualified to own their own teams as the company scaled. Seniority in the company does not equal management skills. You might have the most senior developer that just wants to code. They don't want the trouble of running a team, and that's just perfectly fine. Don't assume that a promotion to a manager is what people want or what people need or what's best for your company. We have a structure that we use that's useful for this, but I'll get back to it. The next ramp up is scaling to 25 people. But again, before I go into that, I want to talk about our sponsor for today's video, which is ChurnMogul. We use ChurnMogul to track our SaaS metrics, our MRR, our churn rate, our LTV, cohort tables on our use, depending on where the customer came from, and even revenue from our non-subscription side of the business. The guys from ChurnMogul are offering up to $600 in credits if you sign up using churnmogul.com/Slidebean. And if your company still hasn't reached 10K MRR, you can use ChurnMogul for free. But let's get back to scaling the team. This is team 11 to 25. As your team grows to 25 people, the dynamic of the company will start to change pretty dramatically, as well as how team members interact with each other. When you're a tiny team, especially a tiny startup, honestly, you can get away with a lot of things that seem normal in the context of that company. For example, many team members brought and used their own laptops for work, and back then, as a tiny startup company, that was fine. But as you grow, you'll see that the structure of the team, how formal you need to be about some of these things, that changes drastically. And that was honestly a bit of a surprise for us because we operated for years as a very intimate, very friendly organization. But more than that, the biggest surprise was how at this stage, doubling the team did not mean doubling our productivity. During this ramp up, we scaled from 2 engineers to 6 and from 2 marketing team members to 5. But the productivity from both of those teams did not increase proportionally to the amount of people that we added. We should have tripled productivity. The thing is that at this stage, you have to account for management, for delegation of tasks, for coordination, for communication between teams, and that takes time. At this stage, hiring gets a lot easier because you're now hiring people with a specific set of skills for a specific role. For us, for example, it was a Webflow developer or a digital animator with experience in motion graphics or someone really good at Google Ads. These are specific people with specific roles and expertises, which also means those people will probably not get involved in the other stuff that the company is doing. When you're 10 people, you essentially have everybody doing a little bit of everything, and therefore everybody is mostly in sync all the time. But when you have 20 people, you start to have people who have their head completely buried in this specific task that you hire them to do, and they're becoming absolutely killer at that one task. But again, they probably don't care too much about the specifics of what a whole other team does. So at this point, you have to define some hierarchy here as management positions. And we've gone over many iterations of this, but I'm going to give you the one that we use now, which I think is the better curated one. Now, I should say that by this time, we already had some mid-level managers in the company and one senior manager who had become our chief revenue officer. But the structure that we had back then had a bunch of flaws, and again, we had to work really hard in solving this one for the next stage of the business, which is team 25 to 50. Again, we're halfway there. Our team is 36 full-time employees today. Now, since our scale was fast and the tasks within the company have changed dramatically over the years, there is a good chance that you are going to end up with an org chart that does not make a lot of sense at first glance. And that makes sense. Like, that happens when you're a startup, but it needs to make sense. And at this point in the organization, you need to worry about a lot of things that maybe weren't that relevant before. For example, you need to be able to standardize salaries so that team members with comparable roles with comparable experience earn comparable salaries. You'll probably be able to afford more experienced team members that aren't necessarily hired as managers. So we've had a couple cases where this new hire would have a salary expectation that's higher than the person that they'd be reporting to, which means that you have to adjust both salaries in order for that compensation to be fair between the manager and the subordinate. We also had to deal with teams that no longer made sense because the structure of the company has changed so much. So teams had to be broken up and rebuilt with a new manager or a new set of tasks. So a lot of what we've done over the past couple of years when we've been in this category has been just cleanup. Not firing people by no means, but just defining their roles much better within the organization. So our current structure looks something like this. Employees are team members that are dedicated to one or two very specific tasks. Leads are team members who have a higher authority or a higher seniority than the rest of their peers. We acknowledge that authority with a title and a bump in their salary. Many leads aren't ready or just don't want to actually become managers, to manage people. So their focus is just being great at the tasks that they own and being sort of like the spearhead for that team. We now have a bunch of project managers in the organization which don't have direct reports. People don't report to the project managers, but they're sort of like the right-hand person to their manager, and they help them coordinate and delegate tasks within their team while taking some tasks of their own. Next up is managers, who of course manage teams. Some teams are small, as little as 2-3 people, but a manager is defined by their capacity to own and track a KPI that's key to the organization, their capacity to delegate tasks and to see those tasks through, and their capacity to manage a team, which is of course easier said than done. There's this human side to having somebody that reports to you. It's about understanding what motivates them, knowing and caring about what's going on in their lives, how to retain them, how much to pay them really, and at the same time going through the very tough process that is letting them go if it's necessary. So it's not for the faint of heart, and it's just not for everyone. Now, next up, we have directors. Today at Slidebean, we have 2 directors who are our head of product and our agency director who leads our consulting branch that has over 10 employees. Now, directors completely own specific branches of the team and have one or more managers that report directly to them. And I think that their defining characteristic here is the capacity to own these large teams, this deep understanding of all the tasks that their teams do, and their ability to make metrics-driven decisions that, of course, are going to have a massive impact on the company. Our two directors also have a very big influence in the direction that the company takes. They have the visibility to have an input in many of our decisions, and if they're in that position, it means that the founders respect their opinion strongly, and they can, of course, sway us to one side or the other. Now, above directors, all we have is officers, but at this point, all of our officers are co-founders. So this is by no means set in stone. This is just what has worked for us and what we've learned to adapt, taking from a bunch of different sources, but I hope it was useful. Let us know in the comments if you'd like me to dive a lot deeper into either one of them, and don't forget to hit that subscribe. See you next week.